She never thought that day would end up changing her life completely. Amy Hayes, 42, had been working tirelessly at the same company for over a decade, climbing each rung with effort, never skipping a step, never complaining. She was the first to arrive, the last to leave. For 3 years, she had led a growing team, sacrificing weekends, vacations, and even her health to make it all work. And although she never said it out loud, deep down she hoped that one day her commitment would be recognized as it deserved. But that day, instead, she received the greatest humiliation of her career. It all happened in the conference room, mid-morning. Amy was holding her coffee cup and checking the operating indicators for the umpteenth time when Arthur Olin, the company's CEO and also her father-in-law, stood up to make an important announcement. The room was packed. Department heads, managers, human resources. And Lily Monroe, Arthur's niece, who had been working there for just 8 weeks. In a solemn tone, Arthur announced that Lily would be the new regional director. Amy's face didn't move, but inside, she felt something silently snap. It wasn't just a missed opportunity. This was the position she'd been promised for years, not once, but several times. She'd worked for it, hoped for it, deserved it. But in front of everyone, all she received was a condescending gesture and a phrase that echoed with contempt, that she would have the honor of guiding Lily through her transition, as if her only value was serving as a stepping stone for someone else. No one said anything. No one stood up for her. Only lukewarm applause could be heard, more out of commitment than conviction. And she stood there, her heart heavy, feeling completely invisible. When the meeting ended, the others left, conversing in whispers. Amy sat for a few more minutes, without moving. Lily approached, awkwardly, trying to be friendly. She said she admired her work, that she hoped she could learn a lot from her. Amy smiled politely, but inside, she wasn't there anymore. Something had broken. It wasn't just anger. It was a deep sadness, a disappointment that went beyond work. She began to see clearly everything she had given. Years of loyalty, energy, ideas, even her personal life. And suddenly, she understood something she had never allowed herself to think about, that for them, she had always been expendable. Later, while eating lunch alone in the executive floor dining room, Amy tried to process what had happened. The food wasn't touched, cold, and she barely moved her fork. It was then that she heard voices in the adjoining room, separated by a glass wall and a thin panel. She immediately recognized Arthur's tone, unmistakable. He didn't speak like the impeccable CEO who used measured phrases in public, but with arrogance, with a suppressed laugh. He was talking to Lily, and what Amy heard stopped her in her tracks. Arthur told Lily not to worry about Amy, that she was a predictable woman, the kind who never leaves. He added that at her age, with her profile, she didn't have many options on the market and that there was no risk of her giving up. He spoke of her as if she were an old piece of furniture, functional but forgettable. Every word was a knife, and the most painful thing wasn't what he said, but how he said it, with that mocking, confident tone, like someone who thinks they control all the pieces on the board. Amy didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just gulped and felt something inside her freeze. When she returned to her office, she was no longer the same. She walked as usual, greeted people as usual, but inside, something had changed. It wasn't anger that moved her, but a cold lucidity, as if she could suddenly see clearly all the lies she had told herself for years. It wasn't loyalty that kept her at that company. It was fear. Fear of starting over, of losing stability, of being rejected in a market that idolizes young people and discards women who are no longer new. But that fear, that insecurity that paralyzed her, had just been trampled by someone who didn't even have the dignity to feign respect. That same afternoon, without saying anything to anyone, Imi drafted a resignation letter. It wasn't impulsive or emotional. It was surgical, clear, professional, polite. She didn't mention betrayals or frustrations. She simply expressed gratitude for the years of learning and wished her success in her new projects. She printed 2 copies and signed them calmly. She wasn't trembling. It was as if her body knew exactly what to do. She placed the envelope in her bag and returned to work as if it were just another day. No one noticed a thing, and that confirmed what she already knew. She had been out of sight for a long time. The next day, he waited until the end of the day to deliver the letter. Arthur was in his office, reviewing some reports when she walked in with a firm stride and a serene expression. She handed him the envelope straightforwardly, without explanation, just a thank you for everything. Arthur opened the envelope, read the first line, and looked up, frowning. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, he tried to muster a nervous smile and asked her to sit down, but Amy had already turned away. She wasn't going to give him the pleasure of begging. Not that day. Not again. Hours later, she received an email from Arthur requesting an urgent meeting. He also called her cell phone. Twice, something he rarely did. He wanted to negotiate. He offered a raise, more autonomy, even mentioned a special project they could create just for her. But Amy responded with the same calmness with which she had written her letter. I don't want money, Arthur. I want respect. And I already understood I won't get that here. It was the first time she allowed herself to speak with the voice of someone who knows exactly how much she's worth. And it wasn't pride. It was dignity. The following days were strangely silent. Some colleagues looked at her with curiosity, others with discomfort, as if her departure had stirred up something no one wanted to talk about. Margaret, her colleague at the finance department, was the only one who really reached out. She told her she admired her courage and that she wished she, too, had the strength to leave. Amy listened empathetically, but didn't try to convince her of anything. Everyone has their own journey. It had taken her years to take that step. The important thing was that she was no longer trapped. 2 weeks later, while sipping coffee on her balcony, with no need to check emails or spreadsheets, Amy received an unexpected call. It was Rebecca Chin, HR director at Horizon Tech, an innovative company she had long admired. She said she had been personally recommended by Daniel Morrison, one of Amy's largest clients at her former company. They were looking for a regional manager with real experience, someone who could truly lead. And they wanted to interview her as soon as possible. Amy didn't hesitate. Her time had come. The interview with Horizon Tech was unlike anything Amy had ever experienced before. There were no silly tests or questions designed to test her. Rebecca treated her with respect from the very first minute, and the most striking thing was that they had thoroughly researched her career. They knew her accomplishments, her projects, and even the names of key members of the teams she had built. For the first time in years, Amy felt valued for who she was, not for who she was married to or how much silence she endured. She left that meeting with a feeling she had forgotten: excitement. 3 days later, she was offered the position, not just as a regional director, but with real autonomy, home budget, and participation in strategic decisions. The salary was competitive, but what moved her most was the company culture. open-minded, ethical, where ideas counted more than surnames. Amy accepted, with a smile, that she didn't have to fake this time. Her first day was a sunny Monday. She dressed easily, had her coffee at home, and arrived at the office without that knot in her stomach that had plagued her for years. As the weeks passed, Amy rediscovered parts of herself she thought were lost. She had weekends free again. She started running in the mornings. She reconnected with friends she'd stopped seeing because of work. It wasn't that her new position was easy. The challenges were real, the goals demanding. But there was a huge difference. Now she worked with meaning, with recognition, with respect. And that changed everything. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone, just to do well what she already knew how to do. What Amy didn't expect was the domino effect her departure would have on her former company. Daniel Morrison, disappointed with the way his replacement was handled, cancelled the contract. Other clients followed suit in the following months. Complaints mounted, errors accumulated, and Lily, lacking experience and judgment, didn't know how to sustain the operation. Several colleagues began reaching out to her on LinkedIn, first with timid messages, then with concrete proposals. They wanted to work with her again. They wanted to feel led, not used. Amy had no intention of forming a new team, at least not at first. But when Margaret called her with a shaky voice, telling her she'd been displaced without a clear explanation, and that she could no longer stand the toxic culture that had taken hold, Amy understood. There were many others like her, competent, loyal, invisible women. So she spoke to Horizon Tech's human resources team and proposed opening to positions in their department. She explained her vision: to build a team that wouldn't have to sacrifice their mental health to perform. They gave her the green light. Margaret was the first to join. It wasn't long before 3 other trusted colleagues reached out to her. They all had one thing in common. They'd been quietly discarded, replaced by people with more connections than merit. Amy listened to them one by one. She didn't promise anything, but she did provide guidance. And when it came time to fill new positions, she didn't hesitate to call them. She knew how they worked, her ethics. In less than 6 months, she had a solid, committed, and most importantly, grateful team. Not out of pity, but for the opportunity to prove themselves in a fair environment. One autumn day, while reviewing some reports in her office overlooking the park, she received an unexpected email. The sender was from the same company she'd left behind. They cordially invited her to attend the annual awards event, where they would present a special recognition for outstanding contributions in previous years. Amy read the message several times. She hesitated. Her first impulse was to ignore it. Why go back? But something inside her told her this time it wasn't for them. It was for her, for the woman who no longer hid behind work. So she accepted. The night of the event arrived with a mixture of nerves and serenity. She dressed in a sober but elegant outfit. Nothing ostentatious, nothing that screamed revenge. She entered the room with her head held high, aware of every glance. Some feigned surprise, others lowered their gaze. Others watched her from the back, with that serious demeanor that no longer intimidated her. When they called her to the stage, Amy stepped up with a firm stride. They handed her a generic, decorative plaque. But what really mattered was the microphone. She had everyone's attention. And for the first time, she used her voice not to justify, but to affirm. Amy took a deep breath before speaking. She didn't have a written speech, but she didn't need one. She looked calmly at the room and in a clear voice said what she'd been keeping to herself for years. I learned something important in this place. That loyalty, without respect, isn't a virtue. It's servitude. And that sometimes the greatest victory isn't staying and resisting. It's leaving with your head held high, even if no one understands why at the moment. There was silence. Some applauded, others didn't know what to do. But for Amy, it was closure. She didn't need to humiliate anyone. She just wanted to make it clear that her worth didn't depend on this place. After the event, several people approached her, some to sincerely congratulate her, others with the discomfort of someone who knows they were a silent accomplice. Arthur kept his distance most of the evening, but just as Amy was preparing to leave, he approached. His tone was gentler than usual. He asked her if there was any chance she would return, that they missed his leadership, that things could be different. Amy listened without interrupting, and when he finished, he simply said, "I hold no grudges, but I am no longer the same woman you underestimated. Now, I am free." That answer wasn't rehearsed. It came from her soul, not with hatred, but with the peace of someone who no longer needs external validation. Arthur nodded silently, and Amy retired without looking back. That night she slept soundly, free of the weight on her chest that had plagued her for so long. She was no longer just a competent manager. She was a woman who had rebuilt herself with self-respect, who had stopped seeking approval from places that would never give it. And that, more than any title or raise, was her greatest achievement. In the following months, her life stabilized with a harmony that had previously seemed unattainable. She learned to set boundaries, to say no without guilt, to understand that success isn't measured by overtime, but by the ability to look at your reflection and feel proud. Horizon Tech continued to grow, and Amy was a key part of the team. But she no longer experienced it from a place of urgency or anxiety. She lived it with presence, with meaning, because now she worked in a place where she was seen, and most importantly, where she saw herself clearly. One Saturday morning, while organizing some papers at home, Amy found an old notebook where she used to jot down ideas for improving processes at her old job. Flipping through it, she realized how much she had given, how much she had created, how many times she had tried to improve a system that had never intended to acknowledge her. She didn't feel sadness. She felt relief, because she no longer needed to convince anyone of her worth, because, finally, she had understood that it wasn't about changing others, but about stopping begging where they would never give. What surprised Amy most wasn't getting out of that environment, but how much she'd gained afterward. She'd started reading for pleasure again. She'd resumed her yoga classes, and most importantly, she'd regained her emotional energy. For years, she'd lived on autopilot, feeling that if she let up even a bit, everything would fall apart. But what crumbled was something else, the illusion of belonging to a place that only tolerated her as long as she was useful. Now she lived with intention, with her own direction, and afraid to start over if necessary. Sometimes, when checking LinkedIn, he would see posts from former colleagues who were still at olden ventures. Many shared motivational quotes, minor promotions, and internal recognition. But a glance was enough to tell him that nothing had changed in the structure. It was still a place where family ties outweighed merit. And while he didn't judge those who decided to stay, he was deeply grateful for having had the courage to leave. Because sometimes, misplaced loyalty can be a silent form of self-abandonment. One afternoon, while walking through the park after work, Amy ran into Margaret. They hadn't arranged to meet, They just happened to be together. They sat on a bench, shared a coffee, and caught up. Margaret smiled more. She seemed lighter. She told her that thanks to Amy, she had once again believed that there were places where one could be respected without having to turn into stone. Amy just nodded, without false modesty. She knew that her example had opened a door for others, and that, perhaps, was the best legacy she could leave. As time passed, Amy began receiving invitations to speak at leadership events. Not because she was a corporate celebrity, but because her story had begun to circulate in professional circles as an example of quiet courage. At first, she hesitated, not liking putting herself out there. But then she understood that it wasn't about talking about herself, but about representing the many women who, like her, had been ignored for years. Taking to those stages wasn't about vanity. It was about bringing a little light to those still walking in the shadows. At one of those talks, a young woman approached her with tears in her eyes. She told her she worked at a company where she was constantly overlooked, where her boss assumed her ideas were his own. Amy didn't give her a magic formula. She simply told her what she would have liked to hear years earlier. Don't confuse resilience with strength. Sometimes bravery isn't staying and fighting in a place that doesn't want you. It's knowing when to leave. The woman thanked her and asked for a hug. Amy gave it wholeheartedly, feeling that her journey had been worth it. Although she no longer thought about her former company often, rumors occasionally reached her. There was talk of restructuring, downsizing, questioned leadership. Lily had been quietly removed from her position, and Arthur had delegated duties after a decline in the firm's credibility. Amy felt no joy about this. She felt distanced, as if that part of her life belonged to someone else. A younger, more insecure Amy, who still believed that effort alone was enough to earn respect, but who had had the courage to change the story in time. One night, as she closed her laptop and looked out her apartment window, Amy smiled for no apparent reason. She didn't need a grand event to feel at peace. She didn't need external validation to feel worthy. She had learned to choose her battles, to conserve her energy, to build environments where she didn't have to defend her right to exist. And although the path hadn't been easy, every step had brought her there, to a life of meaning, balance, and, above all, dignity. And that, she thought, was more than enough. One Friday afternoon, while checking her office email before closing out the week, Amy received a LinkedIn notification. It was a message from a former colleague she'd never been close to, but now writing to tell her she'd finally quit as well. She said her story had inspired her, that after watching her leave so calmly, she realized she had options too. Amy stared at the screen for a few seconds. She didn't respond immediately. She just took a deep breath and felt that quiet pride, the kind that needs no applause. Little by little, she began to realize that her story wasn't unique. That there were many other women trapped in similar structures, in jobs where they were expected to be tireless, silent, and grateful, and that there were very few spaces where this could be discussed without embellishment. So she began writing short articles on professional networks, without drama, without embellishment. She shared what she experienced, what she learned, what she would do differently if she could go back in time. The responses were overwhelming. Dozens of messages from women saying, "The same thing happens to me." One day, she was asked to lead an internal mentoring program for employees aspiring to leadership positions at Horizon Tech. Amy accepted without hesitation, not because she wanted to be seen as a role model, but because she knew how difficult it was to walk that path without guidance. The meetings were intimate, honest. They talked about fear, imposter syndrome, and boundaries. It wasn't cheap. Coaching. It was humanity, and that made all the difference. Amy didn't teach from theory. She taught from the scars that no longer hurt, but that she never forgot. During one of those sessions, a young analyst asked her if she had ever regretted leaving. Amy smiled and answered sincerely, "No, I regret not leaving sooner." The room fell silent. No one expected it, but she didn't elaborate. She knew that phrase would stick in the minds of many for a long time. Sometimes, the most powerful truth doesn't need to be explained. It just needs to be said firmly. And Amy wasn't afraid to say it anymore. Over time, Amy stopped measuring her life in terms of productivity. She learned to acknowledge her achievements without needing external validation. She gave herself permission to rest without guilt, to say not today, to take care of her emotional health without having to justify it. She started hanging out with friends more, revived an old hobby of photography, and allowed herself spaces she'd previously considered luxurious. What she valued most now wasn't public recognition, but the freedom to be herself without constantly having to prove something. One afternoon, while organizing her desk, she found an old birthday card signed by several former colleagues. She had put it in a drawer without opening it at the time. She read it out of curiosity. There were kind messages, yes, but also that superficial tone of those who didn't really know who she was or all the lengths she went to make things work. She closed the card and tore it up without drama. Not out of resentment, but because she no longer needed to carry anything that reminded her of a time when she'd settled for crumbs. In a conversation with her therapist, Amy said something she would later repeat several times. "I used to think that if I worked hard, everything would fall into place. Now I understand that if the system is broken, effort only wears you down. It doesn't save you." It was a moment of clarity. Because for years, she had blamed herself for not receiving what she deserved, as if she were lacking something. But that wasn't it. The problem wasn't her. It was the place, the structure, the unwritten rules that rewarded submission and punished firmness. A year after her resignation, Amy celebrated her 43rd birthday at home, with real friends, without pending emails or late presentations. She cooked her own meals, decorated the living room with photos of her travels, and at the end of the night, she toasted something simple, having her life back. She didn't talk about work, or positions, or companies. She talked about what she learned about herself. And when a friend asked her what she was most proud of from that past year, Amy replied without hesitation, "I learned to leave on time." And that saved me. A few weeks after her birthday, Amy received an invitation to participate in a panel discussion on female leadership in hostile environments. The event was organized by a prestigious university, and she would be sharing the space with other women who had also experienced intense processes of change. She hesitated to accept, but in the end she did, convinced that it was necessary to talk about what no one else was talking about. The silent exhaustion, the self-deception, the price of wanting to belong at all costs. She wasn't going as an expert, but as someone who had survived. On the day of the event, in front of a room full of students and professionals, Amy shared her story without embellishment. She spoke of the public humiliation, of the exact moment she heard her boss consider her expendable, of how that broke her but also woke her up. When she finished, there was a long, genuine applause. Not because it was a story of triumph, but because it held a mirror up to many. A student approached her afterward and said, "Thank you for sharing the ugly side of things, too. Because they always tell us the success part, But no one talks about the pain enough. Leaving broken, that phrase stuck with her. Because yes, she had left broken. She had felt like a failure, invisible, used. But at the same time, that breakup had been the beginning of something new. Amy began writing an anonymous blog where she shared reflections, experiences, and tools for those who wanted to do the same but didn't know where to start. She never used real names, never mentioned companies. She only told the truth. And every time someone wrote to her saying, "You helped me make a decision," she felt like everything she'd experienced hadn't been in vain. One of those messages came from a woman who, curiously, was still working at Olden Ventures. She told her that things had gotten worse, that the environment was unsustainable, that many wanted to leave but didn't dare. Amy didn't respond with advice or promises. She simply wrote, "When you realize you're no longer growing, but withering away, you'll know what to do, and you will be alone." Because if she'd learned anything that year, it was that the loneliness of leaving is less than the loneliness of staying where you're no longer seen. Months passed, and although life continued with its challenges, Amy no longer felt trapped in a routine that drained her. She still worked hard, yes, but she did it with purpose. There were difficult days, complex decisions, conflicts to resolve. But the difference was that now she did it from a place of mutual respect, of recognized value. She didn't have to prove anything. She didn't have to smile to please anyone who privately despised her. For the first time in a long time, her effort and her peace could coexist. One morning, while reviewing his personal notes, he found a phrase he had jotted on the edge of a piece of paper during his toughest days. "Maybe my problem wasn't giving too much, but giving it in the wrong place." He stared at those words for a long time, because deep down, he knew it had all started that way, with small sacrifices that no one asked for, but everyone expected. And that the truly revolutionary thing had been choosing not to continue on autopilot, choosing to step out of the game before losing himself completely. Amy no longer needed to look back in pain. She had forgiven, but not forgotten. Because memory was also a compass. It reminded her of who she was before, how much she had kept quiet, and everything she had built since the day she silently decided to leave. She didn't need revenge, belated recognition, or empty rewards. Her best response had been her own transformation. And if she ever doubted it, all she had to do was look at her current surroundings to confirm that she had done the right thing. And so, without scandal or slammed doors, Amy became the woman she always had the potential to be. Not by magic, but because one day she chose to leave with dignity a place where she was treated as replaceable. She chose not to stay where there was no respect. She chose to believe she could still start over, and she did. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't winning a battle. It's not having to keep fighting wars that aren't worth it.